community around us. And so part of our strategy is a holistic vegetation management program that involves experts. Our decisions are based on fire science and the science surrounding vegetation management and planning. And part of this is the plan includes a prescriptive strategy and a timeline where we sequence annual mitigation activities. And some of these include everything from clearing of the grounds of vegetation, brush, debris from trees, trimming trees, and there's a very specific vegetation management schedule that we use on an annual basis. And our vegetation management plan also includes such mitigation measures as using goats. We typically have goats on site from late May through June. And what I've learned over the years, the 3 years that I've been here now, is that the advantage of using goats is that they're grazers. They eat everything in sight up to the low-hanging branches. And that has proven to be very effective for us in keeping as the fire protection professionals refer to as ladder fuels. If we can remove the understory, that prevents the wildfire from moving up into the canopy of our trees. And so this has been proven to be a very effective program for us. And we also partner through the Hill Forum with Regional Fire Protection Services and the city of Berkeley and with county officials to be certain that we can minimize wildfire in our region. I look forward to the day when we can come together to talk about a more comprehensive regional plan where we can work together to minimize fire danger in our area. So with that, what I'd like to do is to go to the next slide and talk about our COVID experience in our region. And specifically within Alameda County, we have had the local area, the COVID-19 cases have increased by about 500% since Thanksgiving. And so what does that look like here at our laboratory? In the first 10 months, 9.5 months of the pandemic, we had 15 cases of community-acquired COVID-19 infections. And what that means is it's not person-to-person transmission at the laboratory. It's just folks have come to the lab. They've been not feeling well. They've been tested and have been shown to be positive. So we had about 16 before Thanksgiving. And since Thanksgiving, we have seen our case rate double. So for the first 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, we were having about 3 cases per week of people testing positive. And before they came, they may have come on site and then gone home. Whenever we have a positive case on site, we do contact tracing and we make sure that we understand who the person has come into contact with. And in some cases, we've asked some of our staff to quarantine and be tested. And thus far, we have had no on-site transmission, person-to-person transmission here at the laboratory. Our experience since we've returned from the holiday has been that the first week we had 6 cases. And so since Thanksgiving, again, before Thanksgiving, we had 16 cases. Since in the last 6 weeks, we've had a total of 16 cases. And that's consistent with the case rates that we've seen in Alameda County and within Berkeley itself. So as a matter of fact, the city of Berkeley has seen more cases in the last 2 months than they did in the previous 9 months. So what this means for all of us is that we've got to continue to do what we know has proven to be effective. Wear face covering, maintain your distance from others, wash your hands, sanitize areas that you might use. And according to the city, City Public Health is advising that we not have any gatherings, whether it's inside or outside of our households. And that's important for all of us to continue to follow those guidelines, because what that does is acting together with a sense of social responsibility will help us, together with the vaccine, emerge successfully from this pandemic. The final point that I'll make is that what we've done within the laboratory is that we have recently instituted a reduction in the total number of people at the lab at any point in time. We're now at about 1,000. Previously, we had as many as 17 to 1,800 people working at the lab. We're doing that through an abundance of caution to protect our staff. We monitor the density in areas. We have extensive labeling throughout the laboratory, and we work with our leadership team and our employees to ensure that their health and safety is our primary concern. And given that so far, 11 months into the pandemic, that we have not had an on-site transmission, we feel we're proud of what we've been able to do to protect our staff, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to protect our staff. And by doing that, we're also protecting the community. And then finally, we're in the process of standing up a testing program within our laboratory to identify any asymptomatic employees before as they come on site. And our turnaround is less than 48 hours. And at least with a couple of the initial tests, we were able to get a results back within 24 hours. So we're hopeful that this program will be yet another tool in our arsenal for protecting our staff against the virus. And so with that, what I'd like to do is just open up the floor for any questions anyone might have.
Right. Any follow-ups for Michael here? And again, you can raise your hand or your digital hand, and we'll call on you accordingly. Anybody have a question or comment? You can also use the chat as well. We'll monitor that as we go along.
All right.
Some complimentary comments there, Michael, about the efforts being done, and the track record looks really good. Any questions or comments?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Yes, it is.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Michael. We appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you.
It was at the beginning of a difficult period already in 2021. So thank you. Let's go on to our first major presentation, and that's with Jeff Neaton, who is Associate Lab Director for Energy Science, the fight against COVID. So Jeff, we welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me share my screen. Let's see here. And if you, so can everyone see my slides? I'll make sure
yes.
that, okay, hey, great. Oops, that's, sorry about that. I'm just gonna find the pointer here. It's a pleasure to give you this update. And I think Horst Simon, our Deputy Lab Director for Science, has updated you all about 6 months ago. It's fun to come back and maybe share some progress on the work that we've been doing on COVID-based research at the lab. So I will, sorry, get my technical difficulties here out of the way. So just for some context as a kind of a reminder, it was sort of recognized right away in late February as the pandemic emerged that this was sort of an all hands on deck situation in the research agencies and in the government. And it was also recognized right away that the DOE labs, Berkeley lab being one of them, one of the 17 labs, have facilities and expertise and people that are really relevant to fighting COVID across different areas of national need that quickly came up as this problem as COVID is really a pandemic of unprecedented scale. Kind of in testing, in sort of the development of vaccines and various areas of supply chain and even epidemiological modeling. And so actually in the end, through the CARES Act, the original stimulus package, the DOE was awarded about $100 million to do, the Office of Science in particular, the DOE was awarded about $100 million to do COVID-based research. And so the way that was actually handled, and I should just say that there are other national emergencies that the DOE labs have been sort of brought to the front lines of, including Deepwater Horizon, Fukushima, and there have been, so that does happen from time to time. Maybe what sets this apart is it's a little bit of a biomedical nature, and there's a human health aspect to this that is not traditionally in the wheelhouse of the labs. However, given the scale of this, clearly there's some unique facilities that the lab could deploy for this. So the way that the CARES Act money was handled in the DOE, since it's a little bit unusual, and the money came very quickly through the stimulus package, was that they kind of set up an organizing body to sort of jointly respond and work together and identify what one lab could do and what all labs could potentially do together. And so this was coined the National Virtual Biotechnology Laboratory, NVBL. And this was stood up in March 2020 as sort of this sort of one front door for all DOE research in COVID-based research. And it also was set up to kind of work out what are the areas where we could contribute to uniquely and have the most impact, and then also distribute it to the lab. And so since March, I've actually served as the point of contact for Berkeley Lab in this so-called MBBL. So now at the same time as the national level response was kind of ramping up and Berkeley Lab's part of that was being defined, our own lab was kind of reacting to this. Basically this slide kind of gives a summary of all of that, just as a brief bit of context. So when COVID hit and we started shelter in place in the Bay Area, basically Berkeley Lab did start to basically reduce its research operations to the minimum. What ended up remaining open initially were the user facilities, and only COVID research was actually allowed to take place on site. Of course, we were working off-site from home as best we could when we could. But in terms of doing experiments on site, COVID was the research that was allowed. And as Horst, I think, probably went over a few months ago, the lab was able to quickly identify some places where it could start to do some research that might impact COVID, and funded quickly with LDRD funds 6 projects. In addition, there were several public-private partnerships with industry that we were able to kind of quickly pivot. Some of them involved pharmaceutical companies that were just dropping everything and getting into this. And those kinds of work continued. And then finally, we also set up a testing facility that I'll talk about, a testing R&D facility that ended up informing how they do surveillance testing on the UC Berkeley campus. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We sort of so that sort of happened in the early months of sort of March and April. Eventually, we did receive some of the CARES Act funding. We got organized and worked with other labs to bring some funding to the lab, to Berkeley Lab, and we were involved in the end in 5 projects. And so, even though we're one of 17 labs, we received about $12 million in stimulus funds to do research in the last 6 months or so. The other thing we did is we also started to think more broadly about and longer term about what we might be able to do with in terms of responding to, a continued sustained response to COVID, research response, and also other pandemics or emergencies in general. So let me tell you a little bit, let me give you a couple of, I'm going to give you a few examples of research we've been doing at the lab. I want to give you some highlights. Maybe before I start, I want to just say that there's two central pieces to the strategy for Berkeley Lab and how we can contribute to the fight. And one is our unique state-of-the-art facilities, and the other is our people. So let me just maybe say first about the facilities. As you well are aware, Berkeley Lab is home to several, large-scale instrument centers, facilities that are available to researchers all over the world, free of charge through a proposal process, these user facilities, and that really can't sort of be easily supported at a university. So it's kind of a unique set of research capabilities, including the JGI, the ALS, the high performance computing at NERSC, the molecular foundry. And so all of these, so the first thought we had was, how do we bring, these facilities to the front line of this fight? And that's something we were able to do, and I'll talk about that. And then, of course, the second component are the people, the scientists, the operations staff. Basically, there was a very low barrier to getting people involved, even though, as March and April sort of set in, people started working from home. They were, doing their caregiving at home and battling Zoom and all sorts of other things, including their day jobs. But there was an enormous enthusiasm to pivot, to work and contribute to this. And in the end, 275 of our staff have been involved in this, which I think is pretty remarkable for a very short kind of sprint that this really has been so far. So the people and the component, and the facilities are really the sort of unique features of the lab. And so let me just share a couple of examples now of how, where we're contributing to the research and development. So one area has been in the area of PPE. And so two efforts that were funded through the National Virtual Biotechnology Laboratory relate to that. And so one is in masks. And so I think a lot of us have become experts in masks over the last 10 months. Certainly early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of concern about shortages of proper PPE, N95 masks, surgical masks for the frontline workers. So one of the things that, and of course, masks have uses outside of the pandemic, as we've seen in the fall with the smoke in the air and things. And so there was an effort at the molecular foundry where, basically new materials were synthesized that could be used to develop a reusable mask that has a rechargeable filter. So you may know that an N95 mask, the polymer that's inside of the mask that is filtering out the small particles has kind of a steady state charge on it. It's charged. Over time, that charge tends to attract the particles and stick to it as part of the effectiveness of its filtration. Over time, that decays. Also, those masks tend to, for other reasons, not be reusable. So this work has really been, so the foundry researchers here discovered an approach which allows them to use a known material that they can easily recharge overnight with a, simply sort of like your cell phone, and that can trap and neutralize and expel the particles and allow for reuse. And so this is something that isn't available. It's kind of being it's still in progress under research is still being done on this, but this is an example of something that they have been doing at the molecular foundry. And this research actually got the attention of Kaiser Permanente, And at the time, Kaiser was looking for masks which were in short supply and looking for non-medical supply vendors, and was consulting with our scientists here based on some of the preliminary work that they saw at the Molecular Foundry. Another area that was being investigated was looking at sort of ways of quickly detecting the presence of viruses, a virus particle on paper, component on surfaces, excuse me, including PPE. And so Berkeley Lab scientists at the Molecular Foundry, who have kind of expertise in fluorescent sensing systems at the molecular scale, developed an approach that allowed them to kind of immediately, instantly, by shining a green laser pointer, detect the presence of virus if it's in a sufficient concentration. And so this is a sort of an approach that's being kind of developed to increase its sensitivity right now, but it would be a real game changer if it could be developed further, because it would be a kind of a very quick way for anyone with a green laser pointer to detect if there is sort of a virus on a surface. So that's one set of work that's going on. Another has been in the area generally of testing and testing protocols. And so, and including, so basically diagnostic and surveillance testing. And there, one of the biggest facilities, the most important facilities for us has been the Joint Genome Institute. And there we have been using the Joint Genome Institute, which has all sorts of capabilities to kind of read genomes, to do kind of the PCR type testing that is part of the standard tests right now. So what JGI was able to bring to bear was to sort of examine existing testing protocols and try to reduce their complexity, improve automation, speed them up, reduce their cost, particularly associated with reagents and consumables. At JGI, they also developed a new protocol for deactivating the virus. That's another issue. Obviously, you've got this sort of, in some sense, hazardous material when you're working with a test at the front line. And so this research at JGI was not done with any live virus, but it was done with kind of surrogates that allowed these tests and the research to take place. And basically this testing facility that was set up called BLADE, which is an R&D facility, was kind of instrumental in guiding the testing facility that was ultimately set up on the UC Berkeley campus, or at least one of them, the Innovative Genomics Institute set up a testing facility. That is an institute led by Jennifer Doudna, the Nobel Prize winner earlier at the end of last year. And so the JGI kind of so the protocols and the testing approach that was kind of tested at Berkeley Lab at BLADE ended up being used in the surveillance testing that they approaches that they use on at UC Berkeley campus. So that's another sort of an example of impact. As we were talking about before, the user facilities, one of our user facilities, the Advanced Light Source, was one of the very first facilities to kind of begin doing COVID research right at the beginning of the pandemic. There were several pharmaceutical companies that had been trying to collect data for the structure of different proteins at the time that the shelter-in-place started. And many of those companies pivoted to starting to look at the structure of proteins that are involved in the coronavirus, and also looking at ways the structure of antibodies binding to different sites on the protein. So there was sort of this idea that using this sort of incredible tool that is the Advanced Light Source, that one could learn more about the virus structure, how it works, what are its vulnerabilities, so that, how would we design an antibody that would, could address it. And also learn a little bit more about how cells evolve once the virus has penetrated the cell. And so several studies at the ALS this past year have taught us quite a bit about the virus at a really a molecular scale. So this is an example of one where kind of one of the larger proteins was that is very unique to SARS-CoV-2 as a coronavirus. The structure of that was solved at ALS. There are other, as you know from the newspapers, there are many other coronaviruses. This particular protein mutation was quite specific to SARS-CoV-2, and so that actually may help us understand better how to fight it. In addition, different large-scale proteins and their weak spots were addressed with small molecules and their structures imaged, and so this can help with the design of therapeutic drugs. Also, researchers at the University of Washington and Vir Technology, which is a pharmaceutical company, solved the structure of a antibody binding to the spike protein. And so that monoclonal antibody went into kind of clinical trials. So this was sort of this is a work that happened in early June. And then finally, this is kind of some remarkable work that is really possible only at the ALS, where soft X-rays are used to create a tomogram, a three-dimensional image of a cell that's being infected by the virus. And what the study does is it freezes, kind of takes a snapshot at different times of a cell in its sort of progression, in the progression of the virus infecting it, and one can kind of see how the cell kind of evolves, its structure and its key features evolve as a function of time as the virus sort of infects it. So this is an example of sort of things you can sort of see at the molecular scale that then can really translate to provide information that can help us better fight it. The other thing another area of research, and I just have two more examples, was basically that involved NERSC and machine learning, ended up being a very helpful tool that was developed at Berkeley Lab. So basically there's an enormous amount of research literature on COVID that comes out every day. There's about 250 papers per day. And so it's really an enormous amount of literature to try to process in a given day. A lot of work is being done to try to understand this. Basically the urgency and the volume of the research has caused, has kind of led to the prominent role of preprints in lieu of traditional journals to kind of disseminate information. So preprints are kind of a draft of a publication before it's gone to peer review and accepted by journals. I mean, journals often take weeks or months to review. Preprints can be posted immediately by the researchers while they wait for their paper to undergo review. So, there's sort of this trade-off. They allow research to be disseminated fast, but then they also kind of circumvent the review process. So, you're kind of seeing kind of raw material out on the site. There's some flawed papers out there as well as good ones. On the other hand, the urgency of this particular topic really quite a bit warrants the idea that warrants it. Maybe warrants spending a little extra time and sifting through that oneself. So basically, COVID Scholar, right, which I'm kind of showing here, is a preprint server that was developed by Berkeley Lab scientists. And it's there are several different preprint servers, and none of them really are similar, but where this sets itself apart is that in addition to the 80,000 COVID-related papers, it incorporates several other fields papers, and allows one to kind of search through by different keywords using natural language processing, a variant of machine learning that which basically at Berkeley Lab has been developed to understand material synthesis in a different application, but was kind of pointed toward the problem of sifting through the COVID literature. And so the knowledge of natural language processing, this kind of machine learning, and the capabilities of the NERSC Supercomputing Center kind of led us to be able to quickly put this up. And it's getting about 2,000 users weekly. So it's still quite a very, it ended up being quite an important resource for the community. So finally, there is a lot of, there's a kind of an emerging effort at the lab to understand virus transmission in indoor spaces. So there's a lot of interest in understanding airborne virus, and our air quality experts at the lab are partnering with Sandia, another national lab, to use a combination of experiments and simulations to understand how aerosols disperse in rooms under various conditions. So here, the focus is kind of on longer range transport. So in other words, one question people sometimes ask is, what is the probability of viral transport beyond 6 feet? We have this kind of 6 feet threshold, 6 foot threshold. And how efficacious is transmission beyond that, and under what conditions? And so here, what we've done is we've taken a Flex Lab, which is a unique facility at Berkeley Lab that is designed for building energy efficiency study, and we totally repurposed it. And we outfitted it with 100 different detectors, put in this conference room with these kind of crash test dummies you can see here, and then we basically outfitted. We basically we can now, using this, explore different you can kind of introduce aerosols between 1 and 100 micrometers in diameter, different sizes that are relevant to people kind of, what people might be emitting when they're speaking, and look at where they go and how the temperature of the room and how air circulation in the room changes it. And one of the things that the preliminary findings has been, which is kind of interesting and just a preliminary finding, is that on a cool day in Berkeley, if one introduces heat from the top of the room, so basically vents the room with heat by forcing hot air into the top, one sees thermal stratification. So basically the hot air kind of stays near the top of the room and stays separated from the cold air. And so that actually doesn't end up dispersing the particles at the bottom of the room. And so that's kind of a preliminary finding, but it sort of suggests that one needs to really think very carefully about just turning on the heat and assuming that you're going to get full circulation in the room. There's a fluid dynamics to be looked at, and maybe from these studies will some kind of useful protocols for how to circulate and ventilate and rooms will arise. So finally, what I want to close on is just say, these are just 5 examples of numerous different studies ongoing at Berkeley Lab. Funding for many of these projects was short-term. It was really through the end of the last fiscal year. There was no additional money in the stimulus or the bill that came out that was passed at the end of this past year. There may be more money coming for this research, but combating anyway, COVID is still a priority for us, and we want to remain prepared. Even though these projects are ramping up, we're hoping to do more. So basically, over the summer and into the fall, we developed a strategic plan, and that kind of lays out a vision for continued multidisciplinary work that identifies strategies, for ways we can build on what we're doing and basically identifies gaps and capabilities that might allow us to continue this work moving forward. Katie Christensen, actually, who is the head of the strategic development group in the biosciences area, led this effort along with the steering community of representatives across the lab. I just want to say that it was sort of a real kind of great experience to see, really the whole lab come together and think about, what we want to do next in this space. I think we're well positioned to continue this research. I mean, it is an evolving field with a lot of different folks all over the world working, but there's a lot of need. There's still a lack of understanding, I think, so it's quite remarkable what we've been able to do up to this point, and we hope to be able to continue to do it. So I think at this point I'll stop and see if there are any questions for the group. Thanks for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Jeff. Great presentation. And it's just amazing to know that right here in our own backyard, we've got a big team at the lab that's working on the item that's most troubling the entire world. So we have a few minutes here for questions or comments or follow-up. Anybody that would like to ask a question or comment for Jeff here before we go on to the next presentation?
This is Alice in Berkeley. So it sounds like if we have a heating system in a building that's introducing heat at a very high level in the space, say we have 12-foot ceilings, that we shouldn't use the room's ceiling air fans to circulate that air down and therefore disperse any potential virus.
Right. So, it's actually, so there's kind of the preliminary data does suggest that where you introduce the heat and the temperature difference between the air you're introducing and the room air may make a difference. I should just tell you, this is kind of preliminary results, so I don't want to provide you guys. We're not ready to share this with the policymakers yet, but I think that there's, as a general principle, if there's a large difference in the temperature, that will tend to happen with hot air, and that actually could mean that that could mean that virus particles or aerosols could linger. Sorry, aerosols could linger in the room a little bit more than we might want. So I think one of the things that's nice about Flex Lab at Berkeley Lab is that we can change the where the place where we introduce the heat and the temperature difference, and we can then monitor with all the sensors where these particles go. And I think we can, with further research in this space, which is actually ongoing, so you can expect some more information there. We're kind of we can kind of sort out some of these things.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments for Jeff? Okay, I don't see any at this point. So once again, thank you, Jeff, for your presentation. Extremely valuable, and we wish you great success and your teams there at the lab in getting something out to help us all move forward as a planet, as a human race. So thank you again.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
All right. So let's go on to the next presentation, and this would be from Sasha von Meyer to talk about the EcoBlock project, which involves transforming cities. And Sasha is with the electric grid research at the California Institute for Energy and Environment. She's a program director there, and we welcome her to the lab community advisory group, and we look forward to your presentation. Sasha, it's all yours. Okay. Go ahead.
How's my audio?
We can hear you. You're good.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to present a few slides and answer questions about the Oakland EcoBlock project. Yeah, so I teach electrical engineering down on campus in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. And I serve as the principal investigator for the EcoBlock project. I also wear another hat. I'm also a lab employee, and the Berkeley lab is a partner in this project. So I want to give you a little context about the project, tell you about the lab's role in this, show you a few pictures about what this project will look like that we're looking to build in Oakland, and talk about the broader impact that we hope this will have. So the EcoBlock project is one of a number of projects that were funded by the California Energy Commission with the Electric Program Investment Charge, or EPIC, funds that are basically ratepayer funds collected. And this was part of a big program to develop advanced energy communities. And out of the many initial projects, the EcoBlock is one of only two, I think, left standing. So we're in phase 2 now of a 2-phase process. Phase 1 was about doing a conceptual design and feasibility analysis of whether we could retrofit an entire city block with about 24 or so households, combine them into an all-solar microgrid, and outfit all the homes with energy and water efficiency measures, and sort of transform the whole block into a sustainable community, but not by building a sustainable community from scratch, which has been done, but by working with the existing housing stock and working with the families, some homeowners, some renters, bringing them together as a community to do this project, which also hasn't been done. There are microgrids that can operate separately from the grid. Those are usually on corporate or university campuses. They typically have one corporate entity or organizational entity that's the owner. And so from a regulatory standpoint, this is a new idea of actually allowing private citizens to group together and supply their local community with solar power by sharing resources, in particular when the electric grid is out, whether it's a PSPS power outage or some other condition. So this requires a lot of innovation, not just on the technical side. In fact, I would say on the technical side, we're implementing some technologies that had already been developed, sort of bringing them to a new application. It's really on the legal and regulatory side that this is very innovative. And the goal is to make some of these clean energy technologies, but also the resilience aspect, affordable for people who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. So for instance, wealthier folks can afford to put solar panels on their roof, to put, let's say, a Tesla Powerwall battery in their garage, and operate their house with electricity on a standalone basis when PG&E shuts the power off. Not everyone can afford that. And so the experiment here is whether this can be a model to make this energy transition affordable, also to find a nice, easy way to implement energy and water efficiency measures, and to sort of provide a straightforward, streamlined process for doing the design and all the legal and regulatory transactions, which would be way too much to handle for individual families. The goal here is to have a model that can be scaled up and replicated. So phase 1 was a 3-year project led by Professors Dan Kamen and Harrison Fraker in the Energy and Resources Group. And now we're in phase 2, about just over a year into the project. where we're working with a number of different partners. As you can see, the City of Oakland is an important partner. We have energy experts, architects, legal experts. My colleague Rich Brown from the Berkeley Lab is leading the energy team within the EcoBlock team. And the Berkeley Lab, as you may know, has a lot of experience both on the energy efficiency front, but also with smart controls of electric appliances, electric loads, communications, and coordination. And so the microgrid design and control process is headed up by the Berkeley Lab in this project. So the goal here really ultimately is to deal effectively with climate change from the standpoint of reducing carbon emissions, in fact, trying to get to zero carbon emissions, but also at the same time, managing the unavoidable, right? Addressing the fact that there will be wildfires, there will be power outages, there will be droughts, and how can communities deal with that in a way that keeps people safe? As I said, affordability is a big piece of this. There's also another aspect that's more technical and that has to do with making the electric grid ready to absorb the increased contributions from solar power generation, but also from dealing with electric vehicles. As you know, the state of California has ambitious goals for getting rid of natural gas to converting to electric uses, in particular in the city of Oakland. That's a goal, as well as converting transportation to electricity for cars sold in coming years to be electric vehicles. And so as we transition off of the natural gas and the gasoline, which is absolutely necessary in order to meet our carbon emission goals, but we will also be using more electricity, and that can be very expensive to get the electric grid ready for that. So part of the research here is about seeing if the aggregation of households into blocks, into microgrid blocks, can help with that coordination and integration. At the same time, we want to solve the problem that people tend to underinvest in energy efficiency and water efficiency. Even though people can save money on their bills, it's sometimes very hard to get the initiative or even get the initial capital and get over that hump. And unfortunately, that problem affects lower income families disproportionately, where homes may be cold and leaky and folks really can't afford to heat the homes and make them healthy and comfortable. So this retrofit model should help with easing that renovation. And ultimately, we want to have a model for the community to band together and help each other out, in particular in times of need. The hypothesis here is that a city block is just about the right scale for getting that done. We've done studies that show if each house has an individual battery to support all of your electric needs when you're operating separate from the grid, you need a pretty big battery. If you aggregate 20 or 30 homes to share the solar resource and the battery, you can make do with a smaller resource because of the load diversity that you get. Statistics plays in your favor there. And you can also be creative with managing loads and prioritizing them so that everybody can be sure that their essential needs are covered, but you don't have to spend as much money per family as you would if you're doing this individually. Now, if you go to the larger scales, if you're trying to do this at the city or the state level, it starts to get more unwieldy. Our hypothesis is that a couple of dozen families or businesses, small businesses together might be just a sweet spot where you get economies of scale, but people still can work together and know each other and form a homeowners association or similar group where they become partners in this effort. So as I said, phase one of the project was really an abstract analysis. Does this pass the sniff test? Is it feasible at a first approximation financially? Would people go for that? Is it even legal to do? And the outcome was, yes, we think this can be done. It's ambitious, but in the process, there was just so much enthusiastic interest and support from the city of Oakland as a partner and other participants, as I said, in the private sector, who said, wow, this is a good idea, but it's hard to see how any individual organization could tackle it on their own. So right now we are in year 2. We have completed on-site assessments for most of the homes, which meant professionals going in and doing analyses of sort of what are the energy and water uses in the homes, what would have to be repaired, what appliances might fit in here that would make the homes more efficient. Obviously, with COVID, this has been much more complicated. So the contractors doing this followed very strict protocols about safety and distancing. The actual building retrofits may yet be delayed because we can't really have construction work happening in the homes while people are there with COVID. But we still hope to stay roughly on schedule with completing the construction in year 3 and then getting hopefully a year's worth of data from 2022 to 23 to see how this actually performs. We spent quite some time trying to find the right block for this project. Initially, there was a different block that had served as kind of the basis for the phase 1 design analysis. And we're happy to find a block in East Oakland. And I should say that in the public version of this presentation, I've deleted some slides that are more sort of revealing of the actual location. And the reason for that is that we get a lot of calls from the media, from reporters who want to do a story about EcoBlock. And we're still trying to hold off and protect these folks from having reporters knock on their doors and saying, hey, what about EcoBlock? So we're not advertising the exact location. We're calling it the Fruitvale Block because it's right off of Fruitvale Avenue and adjacent to Saucil Creek. And this is a wonderful group of people who are super excited that they were chosen from a list of 11 blocks within the city of Oakland that came forward and said, hey, we want to be the pilot EcoBlock. Now they're going to be taking on, and they're seen here at a block party, they'll be taking on the job of coordinating their homeowners association and their activities after 2023, when the Energy Commission, the lab, and the campus step away from the project, and we'll have them set up with their governance structure and an operation and maintenance contract to take care of their solar microgrid and all the infrastructure. So just a quick picture, and this drawing was based on the original block. What you can see is that there's solar panels on the various rooftops. The idea is that every roof will host as much solar as it can or as is appropriate. The entire community owns all the solar panels, and every homeowner just makes their roof space available so that in total, it can approximately supply the entire demand from the block, even in the winter if there's a prolonged period of being off the grid. Normally, that solar power is going to be injected into PG&E's system. There will be, again, a communally owned energy storage resource, and that will most likely be a battery system, although the project has also looked at flywheels, which are a really cool technology, especially at the scale. We're looking at roughly 100 kilowatts or so. And that technology isn't quite as ready, but so there could be smaller batteries in people's garages or a single co-located battery shed. There will be electric vehicles. Part of the design here is to have EVs that can be charged at the curbside and can be used by the members of the association, so they become available to the community and will hopefully allow some of the families to give up their second car, give up their gasoline car, and sort of gently transition to electrified transportation without having to face the expense of buying an electric car for themselves. We may also add electric scooters or other transportation. As I said, there's an intelligent control system that's part of this, and that's really the Berkeley Lab's expertise in sort of designing how do you optimize and prioritize so that if the block has standalone power as an island while the rest of PG&E is out, how do they make sure that they use the available battery resource in an equitable way and a common sense way? I don't have too much time to get into the water management side of it, but it's an important aspect, and we're frankly still fundraising to add to the project budget and allow us to do more exciting things with the water management as well. You see here some images of managing stormwater runoff, and it's kind of appropriate that we're right next to the creek. We're looking at plantings. Possibilities also are gray water recycling use, particularly for irrigation, ideally rainwater capture. But we start with the water efficient fixtures in all the homes to basically make the whole block more drought tolerant. This is really public data, just looking at the map of income. Again, we're hoping here to spend the project resources in a neighborhood that really could use the funds, and that's very deserving. At the same time, we hope to create a model for the organization and the design of this eco-block that can be adopted, perhaps starting by more affluent communities who can do this entirely without subsidy. And one of our big questions that we're addressing throughout the project is how can this model be financially self-sustaining? It will likely start with very low interest financing. The costs of subsequent eco-blocks should diminish pretty rapidly as we go from the first to the 10th to the 100th eco-block, because things will be more standardized, more streamlined. And yet it's still, we can imagine that wealthier neighborhoods, in fact, have already approached our team to say, hey, can we do this? We don't mind paying for it. The really important objective is to make this accessible for everyone. So as I said, we hope to reduce the costs by, for example, having cookie cutter engineering plans that can be adapted to a particular situation. We realize that no two eco-blocks would be the same exactly. So for instance, even if you're in a different climate zone, in some cases, air conditioning would be much more significant than in other places. Homes have different ages. Some need a roof replaced before they can put solar on. In fact, we're looking at solar trellises as a possibility if it doesn't make sense to put solar on all the rooftops. So there's a lot of design variations, and yet we plan to prepare a handbook that has essentially a menu of design choices that will just make it so much easier for the next team to say, okay, we're going to pick from this list of options that have been carefully studied and vetted in the project, so that they don't have to hire researchers and engineers and architect to the tune of so many dollars to reinvent that wheel. We also are interested in analyzing the scaling impacts for the electric grid. As I said, we're hoping that this will be a less expensive way to make the grid ready to become 100% renewable, to become largely self-reliant locally with local solar power, and to absorb all that new load from electric vehicles, and to do that with a minimum of upgrades in the system, because electric grid upgrades can be extremely expensive. That's going to be passed on through electric rates, and everyone wants that to be minimized. So our team is actually working very closely with PG&E on the design of this, and PG&E is thinking with us about how to make the microgrid design such that it can be scaled and applied to other areas, in particular, some of the more wildfire-prone areas and PSPS-prone distribution circuits, where the reliability really, really comes into play, more so than in this, this particular location. And then, as I said, we're spending a lot of effort actually developing the legal, financial, and regulatory framework so that in the future, a group of neighbors can come together and follow a recipe and say, okay, we're forming this homeowners association. We're going to get a really good deal on a loan. We're going to get an insurance policy, a liability insurance policy that covers this these jointly owned assets, because that can be really expensive if the insurers have never heard of this before. There will be hopefully a regulatory framework where the electric utility, as well as the Public Utilities Commission, sort of have a checkbox that they know, this is an eco-block, this is permissible, and here are the procedures, here are the forms that you need to fill out, here's the planning and the approval process. And so the vision is that this can be a way to really help the state of California, as well as cities elsewhere or suburban areas, to really start to cut the carbon emissions at this community neighborhood level. In my personal opinion, it has a particular value also in bringing neighbors together in sort of a really common sense and practical way. You know, I have this memory of the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989 when I was living in San Francisco. And that was the first time I actually met my neighbors. And we all got together, the power was out, and we were sort of figuring out how to get through this and how to help each other. And so I see the eco-block as kind of a model for a neighborhood to take care of their basic needs together. And with that, I will pause for questions.
Very good. Thank you very much, Sasha. Great presentation. And we have time for comments and questions from the group. Diz has a hand up. Let's go. Go ahead, Diz.
Thank you. That was a super presentation. Thank you so much. You mentioned a couple of times the legal challenges, and Perkins Coie is involved in this. And so I know that there is legal advice, but is there existing statute that is in the way that we need to work on?
Great question. So there is a microgrid regulatory proceeding underway right now. And I think the clause that's the toughest piece of this is this section 218 known as the over the fence rule. And the over the fence rule basically says that I'm not allowed to sell solar power to my neighbor. There is this exception if it's a single entity for their own use that has contiguous adjacent properties, that it's okay to physically transfer the electricity. Our argument is that a homeowners association essentially constitutes an entity who would be producing power for their own use, and who would be sharing both the generation and the storage asset, the battery, and any wires that might connect those, even if the wires cross property lines, that this still falls under the own use clause. The CPUC has not made it explicitly clear that that kind of exemption would be permitted. So, but there are a lot of parties in the proceeding who are arguing for this and similar things, basically saying, you know, this microgrid regulation it is a bit outdated. It's not taking into account modern technology. The fact of the matter is that today, when the power is out, all those solar resources are stranded assets. And in my personal opinion, I think that presents ultimately a homeland security issue. I think that no responsible individual wants to stand there and say the fact that people are out of power, if it's potentially for a long time, is due to our inability to coordinate these existing resources to stay online and work together. So we're getting a really wonderful collaboration with PG&E. Our design right now that we're envisioning as the most likely technical design is to use the existing PG&E infrastructure, which that obviates the regulatory issues because PG&E still owns and operates the wires. And the big innovation here is that PG&E installs a switch that then allows the block to operate as a power island, which is not previously part of their playbook. That was always forbidden. But again, the technology has evolved, and certainly their thinking has evolved, and everyone's recognition of resilience, that this is now part of the conversation. So there could in the future be different models of who owns the wires. We are looking forward in this project to a really constructive process with PG&E.
One follow-up, so that what was the motivation for the over-the-fence rule?
I think ultimately it has to do with the monopoly status of distribution utilities, that no one else is allowed to start a business stepping on their toes. And so this has third-party developers in mind who would say, hey, I'm going to go into this neighborhood, run another set of wires, and offer this power distribution service to this neighborhood that would then be inappropriately competing with the utility.
Okay.
And the catch, of course, is we're not in this to make money. We're in this to keep people safe and healthy and to give them a way to self-organize.
Very good. Thank you, Sasha. Any other questions or comments for Sasha here? Again, go ahead, Sarah Moore.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm from the city of Berkeley. We had a little experience in the first round of this EPIC grant, and so really appreciate that you guys moved on to round 2. You spoke a little bit about the fact that this is now a different block from what was in phase 1, but I didn't quite understand what the process for selecting that new block was. And also I was glad to hear, I was a little nervous early on your partner slide when PG&E was not listed. So was very glad to hear that indeed PG&E has been a partner with you on this. And so in part was wondering if their input influenced the choice of block.
Great question. We did talk to PG&E about the choice of block, but only after we had several finalists and we got their input about sort of the physical infrastructure and what would lend itself to islanding. It turns out the block we chose lends itself to capping off the old low pressure natural gas pipeline. So that was a plus. That wasn't really definitive for the decision. Our main criterion was to have a block where people would essentially be willing to work together. It was the community, the social dynamic. There were some technical criteria as well in terms of, obviously there has to be some solar roof space. And in a sense, it's easier to do the financial bottom line with people who consume more energy. That is, homes that are less energy efficient for starters, because then you can realize more savings and have the project, be financially viable. Our, bottom line is when these folks are off on their own after the project end, their monthly or annual bill has to be equal to or less than what it is now. We can't saddle them with any sort of financial burdens. And so negotiating the tariff with PG&E also comes into play with that. But so the search process was to have an announcement that went through a lot of, through the city of Oakland, the council members and other organizations to sort of get the word out to the neighborhoods. And then block leads or block coordinators applied and told our team a little bit about their block, why they wanted to be the pilot eco block. And we interviewed a number of them and chose a block where we felt that there was sort of the greatest cohesiveness and willingness, sort of also a clear-eyed sense that this is not going to be easy and we're all going to hold hands and get along, because there's going to be some financial negotiations, you know, about whose appliances get turned on and off if the battery's running low, who pays how much, what happens if someone moves or sells their house, what about the renters and the property owners relationship? Is the rent going to go up? You know, a lot of questions come up. So the wonderful thing about this block is that our team and our community outreach team has been able to have a really transparent dialogue with everyone on the block so that everybody knows this isn't just a piece of cake. We're in this together. We're going to work it out.
So Sasha, there's a couple questions in the chat about PG&E, not surprisingly. So the questions center around the relationship of the microgrid to the overarching grid of PG&E and who's in control, what happens in the case of a brownout, and also then who's really involved in sort of flipping the switch from PG&E to the microgrid. Could you speak more to a couple of those issues there?
Those are great questions. So the design as we envision it right now is that all of the assets will be sort of under blue sky conditions, normally feeding into the grid. The battery can perhaps play on the wholesale market. We have to still get into the fine print of the tariff, but you know, you would have solar and battery resources interacting with the grid as normal, but when there is either a public safety power shutoff, some other grid crisis, brownout, some kind of strain or congestion in the distribution system, any of those technical reasons could prompt PG&E to flip the switch. Now, we envision a two-way communication, and in fact, that also involves the telemetry and the data so that the microgrid operator and PG&E's distribution operators will have visibility and communication about this, but PG&E will be controlling the actual physical disconnect switch, which is necessary for them to do in terms of their safety and liability. That also means PG&E retains the responsibility for the maintenance and safety of the wires. But the homeowners association will own and be responsible for the assets and the coordination and communication with them. There's a related project, the Arcata Airport up at in the Redwood Coast that has also worked with PG&E on a somewhat similar model that we've been, you know, talking to them and are looking at which of these design aspects apply to us and where would we modify it.
Okay, interesting. Well, we're coming to the end of our time period here, but there was a question about is the ultimate intent to get down to net zero in terms of the usage of energy that the grid, the microgrid would produce enough energy and maybe a surplus that would zero out the power demand for that microgrid neighborhood.
That's exactly right. So the design intent is to end up with zero net energy so that basically all of the electricity consumed on the block will be produced by local solar on average, right? Staying connected to the grid affords the luxury of importing sometimes and exporting at other times, or supplementing it. One question mark is, we start out with a small number of electric cars. In the next decade, that number is going to increase. And so how much do we oversize the solar resource in anticipation of more EVs that might be arriving? We also understand that when the microgrid is operating as an island, there will have to be some constraints on the energy use, just in everyone's interest. So you have your lights and your refrigerator. You might be, adjusting the thermostat on your heat pump, and taking measures just to curtail in a common sense way so that the resource will last for everyone. So those are still the things to be worked out in the details.
So would the monthly energy bill for the typical household in that microgrid then end up with zero or even a minus energy bill? Or would it also go towards the cost of the construction of the microgrid? I mean, have you delved into the financing and how it would affect individual homeowners?
Yeah, so much of the initial capital would be financed through the homeowners association with basically an annual contribution. We've looked at different instruments that can do that. One way to do it in more affluent neighborhoods is actually with working it into the property tax. You can establish something called a community facilities district. That's harder to do in lower income areas. But so that would be an annual contribution that's separate from the utility bill. The utility bill would become much smaller, both the electricity and the water bill, but there are some fixed charges for staying connected. And the goal is that when you add it all up on a monthly or annual basis, you end up with less than what they're paying now. Obviously, ultimately, the cost of having a gasoline car and filling that up would be on the side of the savings as well.
Right, just so we stay on schedule here, the last question was about natural gas lines. Would they be removed once the microgrid is up and running?
Probably not right away. And one of the interesting complexities that we're addressing is the fact that we're not coercing anyone. Not 100% of the residents on this block will necessarily participate, and that should not be a requirement, because otherwise that would be a big hurdle to scale. So I don't think the gas lines will be touched in the next few years, but in the long term, that certainly is the strategy for the utility and for the cities, for the state of California, to gradually wean ourselves off of this gas infrastructure, in particular, starting with these older gas pipelines, which, as we're aware, they can pose a safety risk. So, they either get renewed and replaced, or the customers will be assisted in transitioning off natural gas to electricity. So I predict that in the coming years, there will be public funds that have to be spent on that transition. And the Eco Block is looking at how can that inevitable transition happen in a way that's really least cost for everyone.
Fantastic. Well, I think we should end it there. We have public comment to go before we wrap up. But once again, Sasha, thank you very much. Let's give Sasha a round of applause.
Thank you.
Surmise from all the interest and the questions here that everybody would like to hasten the day when you can cut the cord with PG&E, or cut the gas line off, as the case may be, or both. So thank you for that. It's a really interesting and hopeful project for all of us in California and beyond. So good luck with that project work. We want to see it expand and succeed. So before we wrap up, we do have time on the agenda for public comment. I don't know if anybody here, not on the CAG or CAG members for that matter, if there's any additional questions, comments, or observations you want to make before we wrap up the session this evening. Anybody wishing to address the group this evening before we close the meeting tonight? Okay, well, I'm not seeing any hands up. I think we're good. I think we're ending up just right on schedule. I did want to make sure everyone has marked March 8th for the second CAG meeting of 2021. So March the 8th, we will of course be sending out announcements to remind you of that, along with an agenda, and we'll keep you all posted on the further activities here that you may be interested in. And don't forget, we are also wanting to get your suggestions. We did have a discussion from the meeting at the end of 2020 about future CAG meeting topics, and we are working those in as we go throughout the year. So if you have additional ideas or suggestions, please send those in to Jen Tang or to myself here at MIG. We're happy to work those into the program. So anything else before we wrap up? Jen, did we cover all the points here this evening?
Yep, that was what I had on my agenda. Thanks everybody for the presentations and for our CAG members attending. It's good to see everybody's faces and wishing everybody a happy new year.
Absolutely. And once again, let's thank all the presenters. It was really informative, and we hope to see you March 8th. All right. Have a great rest of the evening, and stay safe, stay connected. All right. See you all later. Bye-bye. Good night.